dive in specifically on, are you ready for it? Christian nationalism. Yay, Christian nationalism. Like, let me just preface for a second, because when you hear that term, I don't know if you're familiar with that term. If you go on YouTube, if you type it in, if you go on Google, you type it in, if you see it on the TikTok algorithm, there is a lot of differing opinions and views on this idea of Christian nationalism. So for the sake of argument, can we define our terms? Is that okay? Christian nationalism, what is it? Well, Wikipedia has a definition, and I kind of found that most of the definitions on Google were very similar. So this sums it all up, really. It says, Christian nationalism primarily focuses on the internal politics of society, such as legislating civil and criminal laws that reflect its adherents' view of Christianity and the role of religion in political and social life. So, okay, God should be involved in government. The way we run society should be foundational, should have the foundation of Christian values. It's kind of the gist of this definition. But as I kind of did a little scrolling, I went out of Wikipedia, scrolled a little bit on what is Christian nationalism, just to see what would come up. The third article that I read was super funny. Like, get this is what it said. The third article that comes up on Google when you type in what is Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is fueled by white supremacy, the belief that white people are superior to those of other races and should dominate them. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, if you look up Christian nationalism, you will see the word white next to it. White Christian nationalism, Christian nationalist and white supremacist. This is the narrative, or this is the ideology of the left that they're trying to push on the idea of Christian nationalism. So it makes it a little bit difficult to have a conversation with someone about this topic. In fact, I looked at a lot of different scholars and theologians and Bible preachers and figured out what exactly is the view on Christian nationalism in the church. Because I've looked at a lot of political stuff, but let's look at what the church says. And I've noticed as well that people that are very big on advocating for Christianity in the public square are also a little bit hesitant to define themselves as a Christian nationalist because of the differing view and the crazy discourse that society has. And so I kind of will take a step back. And the biggest thing that I was thinking, if you were to ask me, are you a Christian nationalist? Well, the first thing I would say is, well, it depends who's asking and what you're asking exactly. Let's define terms for a second. If you are asking me, do you believe that white Christians are superior among all human beings and they dominate over society? What a ridiculous question. No. Obviously, if you were to talk to any true Bible-believing Christian that believes that God should be involved in the public square, they're going to tell you the same thing. Obviously not. Make disciples of all nations. Duh. But if you were maybe to ask me, okay, well, do you believe that we should make Christianity the world religion and the state religion and force everybody to adapt to Christian policy and practice? Again, I would tell you no, because as a Protestant Christian, I believe that salvation is by faith through grace alone. You can't force someone to be a Christian. You can't force them to identify as a Christian, and we've seen a lot of problems with that through society. So no to those two questions. But the thing that I would come to eventually is, if you were to ask me, do you believe that Christianity is the best idea ever to exist, and that it would be wise for any society or political system to function based on Christian values? I would tell you, yes, I do. Of course, I would not be a Christian if I didn't believe that Christianity was the superior idea, the best idea to ever exist. So this is where we come to. We can agree, no, based on this definition, that the world, it would be wise for any society to base its values and it be influenced heavily by the idea of Christianity. I would tell you, yes, I believe this strongly. In fact, like every single Christian should, you should desire for all nations to be Christian. You should desire for all to surrender to the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. You should be a kingdom builder, building the kingdom on earth. Hello, not just in heaven, building the kingdom of God on earth. So this is what we talk about when we talk about Christian nationalism. It's the baseline of the conversation. And so this is kind of where we start, and you may be thinking, okay, so you believe Christianity is the best idea for all people, fair enough, but like, what about the separation of church and state? Like, don't we get into a little bit of a complicated discussion now that you're involving God into government and being influenced by God? What about the separation of church and state? That's what most people will throw at you as soon as you have this conversation. And I'm really glad that we're actually having this conversation, because so many people don't know the origin of this idea, separation of church and state. If you look it up, you'll see a lot about the atheist French Revolution led by Napoleon. You'll see they've kind of got their own idea of what that looks like. But the originator of this idea actually came out of America in the founding of America. In fact, it's quite often associated with one of the founding fathers and the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, it literally reinstated this or instated it into the Constitution. And for argument's sake, let's look at the First Amendment. The First Amendment. If you wonder why America was still having church when Australia government was telling us close down because of COVID, this is why. This is where the freedom and the foundation of America is. So the First Amendment reads this. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it continues, it expands a little bit, but basically the idea is that government shouldn't be God. Government shouldn't be God. So no, the government should not make an established religion like at the time the Church of England. It's different. No, government should not be God. In fact, the government is not a mouthpiece for God. In fact, it goes a little bit further than that. You'll see it doesn't prohibit the freedom to religion. So in fact, the separation of church and state, what it truly means isn't that church should stay out of politics and God should stay out of politics. Instead, it means that politics should stay out of the church. That the government has no right to inflict its idea of how Christians should live and what church life should look like. If you look at COVID in Australia, you saw, okay, I would actually agree with this. It was very, very crazy, but this is what we talk about when we talk about the concept of separation of church and state. In fact, it's actually something that protects the church from government interference. I really like what Douglas Wilson says. I'm paraphrasing, but he says, if we're going to see revival and if we're asking God to bring revival, then the government needs to stay out of our way. I really like that. It's so true. That is what we are talking about. So every time we have a series on politics, we're teaching it, number one, from what history actually tells you and what the Bible's idea actually is. Separation of church and state is there and designed so that the government cannot inflict its way of how we should do church on the church. It gives the freedom to religion, the freedom to religion, not the freedom from religion. So that's covered. We've moved on from that. And in fact, this is actually a very biblical stance. You guys know during COVID, anybody here like their Christian friends chuck in Romans chapter 13? You guys remember that? Oh, you should put a mask on because you have to submit to the governing authorities. Oh, don't go to church and stay home and have online church because you have to submit to the governing authorities. Can we just pull this apart a little bit? Is that okay? Can we read some Bible, actually figure out what God wants to say? Look at Romans 13. This actually explains this idea of separation of church and state quite interestingly. It says in verse 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authority that exists has been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against God, what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. Now, this is interesting because our government didn't really read the rest of the text. Look at what it says in verse 4. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Okay, so if we're reading this at face value, you are like, oh, okay, so we should just submit to government because they're God's servants and they're doing what God tells them to do. It's a little bit more complicated than that. In fact, we see there the standard by which God has told government they should be operating in. Now, God, as the eternal lawgiver, tells human beings to pretty much gives human beings the authority to govern on earth, right? This is under God, so government should be under God. But it's interesting because you'll notice there's very specific language about how government should be leading and should be governing the people. And the idea in verse 4 says that they are agents of God's wrath and would be there to punish wrongdoing. Pretty much what it's saying is, number one, the government is servants of God, which means they are there to serve the kingdom of God and reinstate what God has established on earth as it is in heaven. That's what it's supposed to be. It not always is. Praise God. It will be one day. Amen. But this is what government is supposed to be, but it's not always what it is. And the second idea here is that government is supposed to, you see, be agents of God's wrath. They're supposed to punish the wrongdoer. Now, this is interesting because who defines right and wrong? God. So the government's role as a servant of God is supposed to punish somebody who does wrong in accordance to God's law. So that means as soon as government now steps out of its authority and says we're going to make our own rules and definition of what's right and wrong, what's sacred and sinful, and what's good and what's bad, now government has stepped out of the role God has placed it in and has instead taken the position of God himself. And that's why we make merch and we wear shirts that say, no, government is not God. I will submit to God, not government. Because when government oversteps their authority, we as Christians, in obedience to Yahweh, the King of Kings, the God above gods, the ruler of all rulers, we say, no, I will submit to God before any human authority. So when human authority contradicts the role that God has placed it in, we as the church understand, okay, I should not be submitting to this. This is the perfect example of separation of church and state. No, government should involve God in things because God is the eternal lawgiver and the government is God's servant. So this is actually the opposite idea of what many people think separation of church and state mean. Paul isn't exactly saying that God should stay out of government. In fact, he's saying the opposite. He's saying, no, God actually very much is involved in government. In fact, God is above the governing authorities. So this is how we understand this idea from a biblical perspective. Straight to the source, you saw it. That's what it is. And so a nation, by biblical standards, government is supposed to reinstate what is right in accordance with God's will and God's law. And if somebody disobeys God's law, 10 Commandments is the foundation of this. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not covet. Do not, whatever it is. If you go through all of them, the government is supposed to ensure that human beings are doing that. And if they don't do it, they punish it. They are God's servants. And so this is the idea of how the government should be involving God. Not an established religion, so the government should tell us what to do, not based outside of what God has said. It is, I am a servant of God. And so we can see the result of this, what this would look like if a government or a nation did this in a way that was biblical. This is what it looks like. Proverbs 14:34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Righteousness exalts a nation. Some translations say godliness makes a nation great. And so if we're in a MAGA series and we're saying, God, we want to make Australia godly again, how do we do that? Well, we go back to righteousness. We make sure that our government is doing what God has said, holding people to account based on the eternal law of God. That is the only way we will see our nation, Australia, great and godly again. This is the foundation of every idea of how God should be involved in government. And that's why we do series like this. Because so many people think, okay, government is one thing, politics is one thing, and church is over here and it's another. I'm like, that's actually a very new idea. Historically speaking, it didn't exist. Look at most of the figures in the Bible. They had some sort of involvement with the political powers of their time. You are like so on your own with this if we're going to look at the biblical perspective. And so that's why we have these conversations, because we want to see Australia be godly again. We want to see our nation be great again, and that will only happen by righteousness, right standing before God. That's what it means. So we're all on the same page here, right? That's what we want to see. In fact, every Christian should have that view. That's the biblical view. That's the right view objectively. We should want to see our nation great again. But it's interesting because some of you might be like, okay, I get it, like, you know, that's what Christian nationalism is, making this nation, the foundation of it on Christian values, influenced by Christianity. I can agree with that, and I can understand what the definition of separation of church and state means now. I get it. But what about like the non-Christians? Like, what about people that don't necessarily believe in God and don't care what God's standard is and don't really want to be involved? Should you force that ideology on people? Well, it's interesting because if we're going to look historically, and this is where I'm going to argue to that group, because I can give you all the Bible in the world, but if you don't care about what God says, then I'm not going to convince you of anything. So let's look at the fruit of Christianity. I would argue historically, not even biblically, let's play your game for a second. I would argue historically, Christianity is the best idea for any nation, Christian or not Christian. Christian or not Christian, Christianity is the best idea. And before we get into why that is, I want to kind of look at the opposition, because you saw in the beginning, we addressed the misconceptions about what the idea of Christian nationalism is. To be a nationalist is to be a patriot that loves their country, and to be a Christian nationalist is to be a Christian that loves their country and wants to see godliness in their country. So what the left tried to do is they try to brand the idea of Christian nationalism and Christianity in general, by the way. They like to brand it as oppressive. Oppressive. Everyone say oppressive. That's like the mean, scary word that the left love to use. In fact, it's a buzzword. It's like it's like their draw four card, like oppression. It's the favorite thing that they like to play. And what they will say about Christianity is oppressive. And this stems from Marxist thinking. Anybody know Karl Marx? We don't like him, just to let you know. We don't like him very much. And the reason is because who was this person that quite literally shaped the ideology of the Western world in a demonic way? This person, Karl Marx, especially in the educational field, all of Hollywood, it's all based out of Marxist thinking. Karl Marx was an economist, an atheist, a communist, all the ists that we don't like. That was this guy. Karl Marx, terrible person. He also smelt really bad. Just another reason to be like, ooh, staying away from this guy. But he actually reflected this ideology and held this idea that capitalism was the evil of society. Capitalism, right? Free market. And so his response as an economist was communism. We need to see a different idea that's in the society. And what he saw as well as a rabid atheist who hated Christianity, hated God, and if you look at his writings on it, it is terrifying. He was very clearly demon-possessed. But this guy, he argued that capitalism was terrible and it was a system that kept the oppressed, the rich, the poor. And this was the way that the idea of society would function. And his idea was that Christianity kind of funneled this thinking. So Christianity was also oppressive because it fueled capitalism and capitalist ideology, and the oppressor is obviously the straight, white, able-bodied male. And so Karl Marx had this theory that eventually the poor, the working class, or the lowest of the low in society, eventually, when they figured it out that they didn't have much, they would have some sort of revolution. They would revolt against the rich in society. But at the end of Marx's life, this didn't really happen. In fact, after Marx passed on, this still didn't happen. But his followers, who literally called themselves Marxists, that's how we know them to be associated with him, they called themselves Marxists. Marxists that followed after Marx's teaching, they kind of adapted it a little bit. Specifically, this man known as, Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian intellectual, a Marxist intellectual, and he developed Marxist theory that, the problem in society is there is some sort of disparity with the rich and the poor, but it's not necessarily economic. It's actually cultural. So it's more than just an economic problem, a communism as a solution. In fact, it's deeper than that. It's social. It's cultural. So the idea wouldn't just be communism, it would be a sense of socialism. And so they developed Marx's ideology, and Antonio Gramsci came up with this idea called the cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony. This is what it means. Let me read out the definition and then I'll explain it and give you an example of what it looks like in society. Cultural hegemony refers to domination or rule maintained through ideological or cultural means. It is usually achieved through social institutions, which allows those in power to strongly influence the values, norms, ideas, expectations, worldview, and behavior of the rest of society. Now, if you didn't absorb any of that, let me kind of show you an example of how Antonio Gramsci thought this would reflect in society. So he thought the hegemony, the oppressor, the powers of our time, culturally were the white, able-bodied, straight, heterosexual male, Christian as well. So there was a certain standard of what an oppressor was or who an oppressor was based on the ideology. So Christianity is oppressive. The white man is the oppressor. To be able-bodied meant that you would dominate over everyone else. So he kind of started to list out societally the oppressor, the hegemony, the one on top, the man on top is the straight, white, able-bodied, heterosexual Christian male. That is the oppressor of society. This is Antonio Gramsci's thesis. And this idea is literally in the foundation of many things in society. His ideology was, okay, to have a solution to this, what we need to do is we need to flip the hegemony. So we need to go to the other end of the scale of intersectionality. So if the straight, white, able-bodied, Christian, heterosexual male is over here, who's on the other side? Well, it's the lower class black woman. Everything that's opposite to that, this is where it is. It's the immigrant, it's the Muslim, it's the woman, it's the trans, it's everything that represents the opposite of over there. And so the further down the line of scale of intersectionality that you get, the less of an oppressor you are. In fact, you now end up on the scale of the oppressed. So his idea was, well, let's flip the hegemony. Let's make the gay, lesbian, woman, trans, whatever is on the other side, let's make them the powers of society. So that's why every single Hollywood movie is making all of the Disney princesses black now. That's why they're trying to replace the what is it in Snow White, the dwarves? That's why at one point they tried to eliminate the idea of dwarves because it's making fun of midgets, and they wanted to make them black and different colored skin. They got rid of that idea real quick because people are like, that's just dumb. This is a fairy tale, come on. But that's why Hollywood does what they do. Let's insert every idea of an oppressor into everything so that we can change the norms of society. Anything that goes against the straight, white, heterosexual, Christian, able-bodied male, anything else, let's boost this up in society, culturally make a shift, and convince everyone else that these people are superior to everyone else. That's why it's in every single movie. That's why in every single TikTok video of every Gen Zer, everybody now has some sort of disability. Have you noticed? You'll have a girl that grew up in a very well-off family, a white girl in a Christian household. All of a sudden, oh, I'm now gay, and I have autism, and I have ADHD. It's because they, culturally speaking, are on the side of the oppressor, and there's this societal expectation or societal standard that the more you're on the side of the oppressed, the worse of a person that you are. So what our young people are doing is they are self-diagnosing themselves because they're trying to reach the other side of the spectrum. I don't want to be an oppressor, but I'm white and I can't help that, so what am I going to do? Well, I don't really want to be gay because I'm not gay. All right, ADHD. Yep, I'm a minority. Yep, autism. Can I tell you how many kids have supposed autism now? and they're like talking into the camera and they're like stimming. And I'm like, what is this? All of a sudden now we have a phenomena, everyone has autism. What this is, when you look at the heart behind it or the mind, the evil scheme behind it, is so many people are being bombarded with this idea of cultural hegemony that now kids are trying to make their friends like them and are going down the scale of intersectionality. No, I'm not an oppressor. I know I'm white, but I have ADHD, but I have this. They're doing everything they can to not be associated with the hegemony of the time. And so, Christian nationalism is seen by the left as a facilitator of oppression. It is oppression. Christianity is oppression. But it's really interesting because when you look historically, remember how I told you? I'm not going to argue biblically for a second, for your sake, if you're an atheist or an anti-Christian in the room that wants to think differently. Let me argue historically. Historically, though the left says Christianity is a system that brings oppression, historically, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. How do we prove this? Well, I read this book, it's called Dominion. It's a historian, Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, a different Tom Holland. There are a lot of them in the world, apparently. But this historian, Tom Holland, he wrote a book, and it's pretty interesting because he was some sort of Christian, cultural Christian, whatever you want to call him, but he sought to kind of figure out if Christianity was a true idea and where the flaws in Christianity are. So he really dove into Christianity's influence on the world, and he ended up coming out with this incredible idea that Christianity is the best thing for society historically. Common sense, but let's kind of pull it apart for the sake of argument. And so he pretty much figured out, if you look at Christianity's impact on the world, the core, the foundational idea that Christianity brings to society is that it places value on human beings. Now, if you were to look at the world before Christianity influenced our nation, before Australia or every single country, if you were to look at a pre-Christian culture, and I'm not talking about like the only people really that had this idea to an extent were the people of God, which were like a small part of the entire world. Everyone else was barbaric. They had no sense of right and wrong. They didn't know the one true God. They were polytheists, they were pantheists, they were barbaric, they would do child sacrifice. They were quite literally the opposite of what God had said, which is why the people of God were so sacred and set apart. They were different in society. But if we look at a pre-Christian world, you would not recognize it at all. You would not recognize it at all. And what Tom Holland's thesis is, most of us, the idea that you have about the world and how it should be is because Christianity has influenced your thinking. In fact, let's look at it from a biblical sense. He says, when you look at Paul's teachings, specifically in Galatians 3, look at what it says. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Simple, common sense, right? Yeah, you would think that because you grew up in cultural Christianity. In fact, the place and time that Paul was saying this is quite radical. It's quite radical because if we take a look at the Roman world for a second, Greco-Roman culture, like I said, barbaric as it gets. Like, these guys were nuts. Didn't understand the idea of equality, didn't understand the imago Dei, that human beings are valuable because of the image of God. This was a non-existent concept. In fact, if we pull this apart, okay, there is no Jew or Gentile. Doesn't matter what you believe, you have equal value in Christ. Doesn't matter where you come from, you have equal value in Christ. This is like, wait a second, no, the Romans didn't understand this concept. And if we look a little bit deeper, there is no male or female. What's interesting is because from our perspective, from a culturally Christian perspective, when you look at the idea of gender, and I know the left is taking this a crazy direction, we'll get to that. But if you look at the idea of gender, we see the binary male-female, right? Yes, obviously. Bible outlines that, but the only reason you see and understand that is because of the Bible. To the Romans, this was a culture of survival of the fittest. The strong come out on top. So if you were weak, you were despised. You were nothing. You were a slave. And so the hegemony of the time, if we're going to use Gramsci's thinking, the hegemony was the free Roman male. Because biologically, men are stronger than women. Biologically, men have more physical power than women and children. They were the powers of the time. So the way the Romans viewed it wasn't male, female, and then there's children, and then there's different social groups. No, the Romans saw it as the free citizen, or the free male citizen, and then everyone else. And everyone else who was not strong enough to conquer the free Roman male would be subjects to the free Roman male. They would be slaves. So men, you wouldn't necessarily be tied to one woman, and culturally that was how it should be. No, if you were a strong male, you could take anyone you wanted. In fact, if you leave this room, you can go out on the street, you see a woman that looks nice, you could rape her, and there's no consequences. In fact, that's what's normal. If a woman looks good, she can't fight back. You're the fittest, you're the strongest. Societally, you were allowed to do that. That was the norm. Now you're thinking, whoa, that's crazy. Yes, because of Christianity. Now you're starting to get it. And so Paul, when you look at his teachings, for example, in Corinthians and in Ephesus, where he's teaching to a very Roman culture, Christians, the church, in a very Roman-influenced culture, he's rewiring their thinking. God is transforming these people from the inside out. Paul comes on the scene and he says, husbands, as the stronger vessel, you should, instead of using your strength to dominate and to rape and to cheat and to use as slaves, you should use your strength to love and protect and provide for your wife. You should only have one wife, and you should be committed to her for the rest of your life. In fact, it's till death. In fact, men, you should die for your wife if you have to. You should love your wife the way Christ loved the church. Can you understand how revolutionary this thinking is in a culture where if I am strong and fit, I can do whatever I want and there's no consequences? This was the norm. Barbarianism was the norm. If you guys read up much on the Vikings, like, hello, white people, just flagging the lefties. They think it's just, Anyways, beside the point. But the Vikings were crazy. They would invade places, they would invade Christian towns, and out of despising Christians, they would rape the women, they would steal the gold, they didn't care how they left everything, it was just divide and conquer because I'm strong and you're not. This was the norm before Christianity influenced culture. And so when Paul is teaching this stuff, you as a Christian, a cultural Christian, whether you are Christian or not, you have grown up in cultural Christianity. So you automatically have this idea that humans have value. You only have that mindset because Christianity taught that. You only have that mindset because we've decided to base our law on some sort of divine idea, not what humans say is right and wrong. And then Paul continues, there is no slave or free. Now this one's interesting because if you look at the New Testament, there's really not much writing and instruction about how we should free the slaves and end slavery. And it's a little confronting when you look at it because you're like, wait a second, why is Paul teaching, hey masters, you should treat your slaves well? Why doesn't he say, hey, have no slaves? Because in this culture, in the Roman world, 2/3 of the Roman population were slaves. 2/3. In fact, the New Testament church was full of slaves. All of a sudden, now they have value. All of a sudden, Christianity is teaching that you are equal in value to your master. In fact, they were treating each other based on this idea. So this is a revolutionary thinking that Paul is introducing, but it's interesting because you are not okay with the fact that the New Testament doesn't really teach you should have no slaves. Yes, it's because Christianity told society that slavery is bad because it devalues human beings. That's a Christian idea. And so when we look at the idea of slavery, it's really interesting because not only is slavery an idea that Christians associated themselves with, they sat at a table and dined with a slave, culturally not acceptable in the Roman world, they go a little bit deeper. Paul, when he's addressing himself to the churches, he says, I, Paul, a slave of Christ. Whoa, Paul, don't you know that a slave is the worst of the worst? In an honor-shame culture, you're not only associating with the slave and eating with the slave and being intimate with a slave now, you are actually taking the position of a slave yourself. Don't you know how shameful that is to do? This is revolutionary. This is the New Testament idea. Paul is saying, not only do I associate with slaves, not only does the Bible tell us we're equal in value, but I am a slave. And you know why this thinking was, why Christianity taught this? It's because of the cross. It's because of the cross. The cross, FYI, was a consequence for the lowest of the low in society. Now, the Romans were crazy with their punishment. The New Testament church, we read, they would strip them naked, tie them to animals, make them fight lions in the Colosseum. Like, they didn't care about the value of humans. You watch a scary movie that has a little bit of blood and you're like, oh, can't watch that. Yeah, no, the Roman citizens as children were watching people being torn by lions in front of them. Different time. Because of Christianity, there it is again. But it's interesting because when you look at this idea, they're teaching the value of human beings. They're teaching that you have value because you're made in the image of God. You can really see, okay, things are quite different to the way that I've perceived it to be. In fact, Christianity is objectively the best idea for society. The best idea. So the cross all of a sudden now became, okay, it is a symbol of shame. It is a symbol of slavery. It is a symbol of being a criminal. It's a criminal's death. All of a sudden, Christians are taking this symbol as something that is sacred. All of a sudden, Christians are taking the cross as a shameful symbol and they're using it to communicate freedom. This is a crazy idea. You know, when you look at the Roman history, if you look at the Roman walls and the Greek walls, the graffiti, there would be crosses on the walls because Christians would associate themselves. That's why we have Christian. You know how, like, culturally you have Christmas, people don't say Christmas, they do a cross. It's because in Greek culture, a cross was a symbol for Christ. So it's so interesting. They would put crosses on walls to say, I am a Christian, and Christianity spread here. That's how we know where Christianity spread historically, because the graffiti would show they would put crosses on the walls to say Christians were here. It's such a revolutionary concept that a Christian would take a symbol of shame and slavery and identify themselves, not just themselves, they would identify freedom with a symbol that was once associated with slavery. Christianity, quite literally, though Marxism tries to claim it, Christianity taught the idea that a victim can become a victor. A victim can become a victor. In fact, the idea of an underdog only exists because of Christian thinking. And so Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, he has this theory that the very people who are hostile to Christianity are hostile because of their own Christian thinking. What's one example? You guys know how much I love feminism. That's a joke, obviously. So interesting about feminism is the feminists' main argument, even though when you look at historically, it was based out of atheistic thinking. That's just one thing for you there. Maybe we'll talk about it in 3 weeks. Maybe I'll do a feminism sermon. But if you think about feminism, okay, I'll give the people what they want. Just come and ask me after the service what you want, we'll do it. But feminists really take this idea that, yeah, we're fighting for equality. Men and women are equal. I'm like, okay, where did you get that idea from? Christianity. Like, before Christianity, women were objects and men could do what they wanted with them. It was Christianity that taught the dignity of women. So feminists, you're a little late to the party. You should have been teaching on this a long time ago. In fact, this is where the dignity of women comes from. It's Christianity. It's not an atheistic socialist ideology that tries to claim justice and freedom for the oppressed. It was Christianity that did that. You just stole it. What about Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter. Okay, but why do Black Lives matter? In fact, why do any lives matter? It's because Christianity told you that. It's because Christianity taught you that humans have value because they're made in the image of God. You only fight for justice because Christianity framed your thinking and you understand that male and female and black and white and slave or free have inherent value. It's because of Christianity. It's not because you and your self-righteousness think you've come up with a better idea. Christianity is the supreme idea. It is the best idea to come into the Western world. It is the only way that a nation can be free. Christianity set a standard and a value for male and women. It set a standard and a value for slave or free, Jew or Gentile. Doesn't matter what you look like, what color your skin is, you are valuable and you should treat others based on that value. This is Christian thinking. So it doesn't matter how many Marxists come up to you, feminists come up to you, Black Lives Matter activists come up to you. Christianity formed their thinking in the beginning, but they claim to be arguing a new idea that is better than Christianity. So, Christianity is the best idea in the entire world. We can end the sermon there. You're welcome. It's really not, you don't have to look very far to see why Christianity is the best idea, not just for the Christian, for the non-Christian, for every single person. In fact, it's the symbol of freedom. Christianity is actually a little bit too tolerant. It allows freedom to the point where now they're telling us what we can't do. Christianity did that. And so if you look historically, Christianity, though the Marxists say that it's a system of oppression, it is the exact opposite. It is a system of freedom, not just for the Christian, for the non-Christian. You have a freedom to do whatever you want. You have the freedom of choice to choose to follow God or to not follow God. But God has standards, morality. As soon as you cross his moral line, there are consequences. This is the divine law that every single society, if it was wise, should follow. And so, this is why Christianity is the good idea, but you'll still have some delusional people that will say, okay, we don't like Christianity, communism, well, it's a bit much. Let's go for secularism. Let's have a secular society, right? And what secularism claims is, let me read out the definition. It says, secularism is the principle of seeking to conduct human affairs based on naturalistic considerations, uninvolved with religion. Okay, so this is interesting because when we pull this apart, what secularism claims is neutrality. It's like we're not picking sides, we're not going to base our idea off anything. Let's just sit on the fence. Like everything is right and nothing is right kind of thing. You can see where this goes a downhill direction. But for the sake of argument, let's pull it apart. What secularism teaches, the biggest problem with it is it says it's based on naturalistic thinking. Okay, well, we already spoke about this in week 1 of the MAGA series, that actually the divine law, God's eternal law, is actually reflected in nature. So even if you're going to do base society, its operations, its regulations, everything based on naturalistic means, then you're actually doing it based on God's means because he reflects his divine law in nature. And another thing secularism claims with this definition is that there is a sense of morality that can be found outside of religion, outside of Christianity. Well, we know that that's not true. Not only is God's divine, moral, eternal law above nature and it reflects itself in nature, we have learned historically, and it's kind of common sense to be honest, that if you leave human beings to their own devices, they end up destroying everything. There has to be some sort of eternal anchor, as Doug Wilson put it in the beginning of the sermon we mentioned. There has to be some sort of transcendent anchor to how society runs. It's got to be beyond human beings. Human beings cannot determine what is right and wrong. Why is that? Well, it's interesting because let's just take one of the commandments, do not murder, right? Let's, for argument's sake, ask a lot of different people groups. This is what happens in a so-called secular society. If you were to ask a Christian, hey, what's the standard for murder? A Christian will tell you, well, the Bible teaches, and this is what is absolutely true, is that murder is wrong because human beings have inherent value. They're made in the image of God. You should not murder. If you were to ask a Muslim, on the other hand, they'd have a different answer. They would say, well, based on the Quranic teaching, is that there is a different standard for murder. In fact, there are some cases where murder is allowed and justified, one of which is apostasy. If you leave the faith, you should be killed. In fact, that honors Allah. Another is homosexuality. If you practice homosexuality, you're an abomination to Allah and we can murder you. So they're a little bit different, don't you agree? Now let's ask the atheist. If you were to ask an atheist, hey, what is the standard of murder? When is it okay to murder? When is it not? An atheist in their evolutionary thinking will tell you that some human beings are more valuable than others. This is what evolution pretty much teaches when you look at the reality. And we saw that, by the way, historically. There's a reason Hitler hated Christianity. There's a reason Hitler hated Christianity. The idea that weakness triumphs over power is like repulsive to elites. It is repulsive to elites because evolutionists and atheists, which is the same idea, evolutionists really have this idea that some are more valuable than others because survival of the fittest. Some are more powerful, some are smarter, some are more evolved, and the ones that are more evolved are more valuable than others. And you may look at this and say, well, that's just your perspective. That's not true. Atheists don't believe that. Evolution doesn't teach that. Well, if we look historically, in the time of Nazi Germany, they were practicing what's known as eugenic experiments, because they believed that we should kill off the weak ones in society. For our society to thrive and for us to be the strongest nation, we should kill off the weak ones in society. So, black community, let's kill them off. They're not as evolved. The immigrants, let's kill them off. They're not as evolved. This is atheistic thinking. In fact, it's this thinking that brought in the idea of abortion in the 60s. Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist and atheist, saw, number one, capitalism as oppressive, number two, Christianity as oppressive. It's very Marxist, if you ask me. She got her thinking from Marx ideology. And so this is the standard by which atheists and evolutionists will tell you that some are more evolved than others. So in some cases, yeah, it's okay to kill people off. The end justifies the means. This is utilitarian thinking. It is atheistic thinking. And so, I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think that human beings shouldn't be the deciders of what is right and wrong. Human beings shouldn't be the ones that determine what is morally okay. We need a transcendent, perfect, holy being to tell you what is right and wrong. If you were left up to your own devices, you would destroy the world. In fact, we've done that once before, and God had to wipe it and then say, let's do a redo because you guys suck. We, human beings, should not be left to our own devices. History proves that. The Bible proves that. And so that's the first problem with secularism. The second problem with secularism is it claims neutrality, which doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. You cannot have some sort of neutral stance. In fact, if you don't stand for something, you don't stand for anything. That's the whole point. And so our society, Australia, claims to be a secular state. It claims to be a secular nation. Well, it's interesting because when you look at the government programs and the government systems, it's not exactly secular because they do take a stance on some religious affiliations. It's not all societies and all religions and everything is equal. No, there is some regulations about what the church can do and what the church can say and what Bible verses are good and what's bad. But when it comes to Aboriginal spirituality, no, let's insert that in every single thing that we can. And if a Christian stands up and says, no, I don't want to do that, let's threaten their job. What's one example? It's going to come up on the screen. This is what Aboriginal spirituality looks like in a secular culture. Doesn't seem very secular, does it? Doesn't seem very neutral. It's in every single footy game that you watch now. It's annoying. They have a smoke ceremony. It's in government-funded schools, primary schools. It's in Parliament House. When they actually have some sort of important meeting that involves, hello, you and I, the Christians that live in this country, that is what they are opening up these conversations with. This is not neutral. This is demonic. This is not neutral. This is demonic. I'll say it again because some of you didn't hear me the first time. This is not neutrality. It's delusional. Secularism is not neutral, and that's a delusional statement. To believe that secularism doesn't pick sides. In fact, if we look at Sydney, one of the biggest streets that we have known as Anzac Parade, right? We look at the parades we're supposed to have on Anzac Parade. You're supposed to be waving love for country and honoring the men that died for us to live in freedom. This is what it's supposed to look like, but this is what it's been looking like in the past few years. Instead of waving Australian flags and honoring people that died literally reflected what the gospel is, to die for someone else so that they can live. That's the message of the gospel. Instead of celebrating and honoring that, this is what our government funds now. This is what our secular state sees as neutral. Anybody see Albo post that a multiculturalism thing? See, this is where multiculturalism kind of is sneaky. It sneaks up on you a little bit. And this is really where going a little bit of a different direction that I wish we could spend an entire sermon on this, but the idea of immigration. Now, to be honest, we can't really do a deep dive in this and look at it from what the Bible says, how we should do it, because the situation of the biblical text and the time they were in and the way that they were doing immigration looks very different to our time. They didn't live in a democracy, it was a theocracy. That's just one of the differences. So what we can look at is what we do see from a biblical perspective, because this is what like I said, I'll get to it, the lie of multiculturalism comes from. When we look at the idea of immigration in general, what we can see from a biblical perspective is we should welcome immigration to an extent that when you look in the Bible, every single time God blessed a nation and blessed the people of God, other people would flood to it. They would say, whoa, that land is prosperous. That land is wealthy. That land is winning all of the battles. It's safe. It'll protect me. I'm going to move my family and we're going to reside. So immigration is actually a good sign. The fact that people want to come to your country is a good sign. It shows that there is a good reason that they want to come. But the standard in which the Bible tells us is that, yes, they would welcome the immigrants, they would welcome everyone, but there was a standard. In fact, there was a condition. And this looks different to us, but I'll explain what I mean. The condition from a biblical perspective was, yes, you can come and join the people of God, but if you do, you have to deny your gods and you have to praise Yahweh as the one true God. Now, we can't exactly institute this idea in our culture because, yes, that would be church and state merging. It's a little different in a theocracy. But what we can see from this ideology is that the reason that they could welcome immigrants is because these immigrants would consent to assimilate. What does assimilate mean? It means, if my values and way of life contradict and threaten the way of life of the place I'm trying to find refuge, I will leave my way of life at the door and I will assimilate with a new way of life so I can give my family freedom. Assimilation is actually very important when it comes to immigration. So the biblical standard was assimilation is essential. Otherwise, if you have so many different cultures coming into a Christian culture, in fact, it's way deeper than just culture. It's actually religion. Nobody cares what color skin you are. If you want to come, come. But what I do care about is, does your idea that you live by, does it tell you that you should kill me if I don't do what your God tells you to do? Because then I don't want you to come here. Wait a second, does your ideology say that this is how government should run and this is how what we should teach in schools and this is what I should wear? Wait, okay, now we're going to have a bit of a different conversation. The threat of multiculturalism isn't exactly culture, it's religion. And this is what secularism does, is it says all religions are equal, all religions are important, and you cannot have a society where this idea works. Because what happens when a Muslim and a Christian come face to face and then a gay person comes in the room and now you have three people and the Muslim wants to kill the gay person and the gay person hates the Christian and the Christian's like, hey, I just love both of you but I don't agree with your lifestyle. Then both of them want to kill them again. How the heck do you run a society with ideas that make the foundation and identity of human beings? This is not just I have a different way of viewing the world. This has shaped my identity and my lifestyle is going to reflect it in every single way. This is the problem we have with mass immigration. When you have so many people coming with an opposite ideology to the culture that you've created, now the very reason that they're coming to the society, to a country, is actually going to be destroyed. In fact, the reason they want to come to specific countries is because of Christianity. Christianity sets people free. It creates a free society. It is the best system. So people want to come to Christian nations, but the problem is they're bringing in an anti-Christian and demonic idea. And so what we've had every single Sunday for the last year, since October 7th last year, it's going to come up on the screen. On the same place that the Anzacs or the men and women who represented freedom and our country, now it's replaced with Palestinian protests. Free Palestine. This is what's taking over Sydney. In fact, tomorrow marks 1 year since the terrorist attack on Israel. 1 year ago, can you believe it? And tomorrow they've planned one of the biggest protests. In fact, it's happening now. Look on your phone after the service if you haven't already seen. It is one of the biggest groups and rallies that we've seen in Sydney, and it's terrifying. And the reason it's terrifying is not because people should be able to do what they want. We're in a free country. It's terrifying because of, number one, the ideology, and number two, the religion attached to it. See, multiculturalism isn't a problem because of different cultures. You can have your own culture, fine. But behind culture is a religious ideology. And this is where you have a problem. Because what happens when you bring people that hate Christianity to a Christian nation? Those very people who came for refuge end up destroying the thing that provided them refuge. This is the problem that we are facing. And so you guys would know, you would have seen, you guys see Donald Trump talking about they're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats, and you probably just thought of the song. Like, the song gets in your head like nothing else. I'm not even going to sing it. I wouldn't do that to you. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. Trump was so concerned about this, and so many people thought it was the biggest joke. It's like, yeah, the Haitian immigrants are coming in America, and they're taking people's dogs and cats from their backyard, and they're taking their pets, and they're cooking them and eating them, and people thought it was the biggest joke, and it's so funny. But in fact, it's actually quite serious. Why is it quite serious? Because if you really look at the culture and the religion of the Haitian groups that are coming in, one of the biggest practices of the Haitian culture is voodoo. Voodoo. Voodoo is a form of witchcraft. It is a practice that they do where they believe that the false gods, the demonic spirits of their culture, who they believe are the one true God, so they denounce Yahweh in general. Not an idea that can really come with Christianity, if you ask me, but part of the idea of voodoo is that not only is it witchcraft in a sense that you have animal sacrifice, blood is some sort of a means of payment and power from demonic spirits, but voodoo is a little bit different in a sense where you actually have to eat the meat of the sacrifice that you offer to the gods, these false demonic gods. So these voodoo spirits are telling people to kill animals, and if you, a discerning Christian, can see this for what it is, you have demonic spirits bringing people and pretty much controlling their ideology on a Christian land. A land where Yahweh has claimed supremacy. Now you have a different spirit, different demonic ideologies threatening the nation that Christ has settled on, threatening the people of God. This goes way beyond immigration policy. This is life or death. This is a spiritual war. In fact, voodoo is actually what led to the Haitian Revolution. In the 1700s, if you do your history about the Haitian Revolution, French Christian settlers came to Haiti and wanted to convert them to Christianity. And what the voodoo spirits told the Haitian population was, no, we don't want the Christians to come and bring their God. We want to reign among the Haitian people. So you have to actually revolt. In fact, the Haitian Revolution was started based on a voodoo ceremony. A voodoo ceremony is what sparked this inspiration to revolt against the Christian settlers. And so Haiti is known for its voodoo, and when Trump's up there saying they're eating the dogs and cats, he may not know that this is a spiritual war. In fact, I think he most likely doesn't. He's just trying to bring attention to a big issue, which is immigration in the US. But we as Christians know that it's a lot deeper than that. We as Christians know this is not just about welcoming people that want refuge in our country. We read that biblically we should welcome that. We should want that. The problem is what happens when you have hundreds of thousands of them and the hundreds of thousands don't have an idea that lines up with Christian values. It's the opposite value. You have a little bit of a problem. And so the threat of immigration is not cultural. It's not about race. It's not about America only, Australia only. That's not what this is about. It is about responsible leaders, and this is what Christian nationalism is. Responsible leaders who understand before God, I am responsible for my nation, and I am responsible to protect the Christianity that built this country. And so the problem we have with this is it's a spiritual war. It's a spiritual war. G.K. Chesterton has this idea of what it actually means to be a patriot. Because Christian nationalism teaches this idea, it encourages this idea of patriotism, that you should love your country. But I love the way G.K. Chesterton puts it, because he's got a little bit of a dynamic. He says, if I'll be honest, I don't exactly love my country. It's terrible. It's not where it should be. And many of us can agree with that. Many of us can understand that, and we can say, yeah, okay, I see that. I want to love my country. In fact, when I go to America and people talk to me about it, it's like, I find that I'm having a lot of bad things to say about it. I'm like, I wish I could just have nice things to say. If I'm honest, I don't really love my country. I love what it could be, though. And this is what G.K. Chesterton suggests. Look at what he says. First quote is this. He says, men didn't love Rome because she was great. She was great because they loved her. What exactly is he saying? He's saying if a country is good, you should love it. But if a country is bad, you should love it even more. Why should you love it even more? Because you love what it could be. You see what this country could be. You hate it because of what it is, but you love it for what it could be. And so we in this church understand Australia is not godly. This is not the great Southland of the Holy Spirit like all these Christians are saying. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's a nation that celebrates pride, perversion, pagan spirituality, claims secularism and neutrality, but just wants to deny God in the public square. This nation is not good. But I know what it can be. Because I understand biblically, when a people group, when Christians rally and choose to be good patriots, choose to love their country, we will see this nation great again. We will only see a godly nation when the church decides to stand up to love this country. Because I don't know about you, I want to see the nation saved.